Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to go through a list of trends that I have noticed and observed becoming rather common over the last 6 months of the year, and then discuss whether or not I think these trends are here to stay or if they're on their way out. Because I primarily read fantasy, a lot of the things I notice are going to be true of that genre, or at least true in my opinion. Maybe you'll disagree. But some of these are likely existing within other genres as well. So it's not necessarily just specific to fantasy. Before I get started with this though, I would love to know what are some trends that you have noticed this year? What are the ones that you think are going to stay? Which ones do you hope will stay? Which ones do you think are going to leave? And then which ones do you think are going to leave and you're glad to see them go? But anyway, jumping into it, the first one is going to be novellas. I have noticed that novellas seem to be a lot more common than they used to be. This is one where perhaps this is just my perception of novellas being skewed because I am starting to read more of them. But for a long time, in fantasy at least, novellas were not all that common. And I think that's due to the fact that so many fantasy readers are accustomed to these massive tomes. We're accustomed to stories taking time to develop because you're creating a brand new world. And a lot of times when you're doing that, you need time to flesh everything out and then firmly plant your reader's feet on the ground within that world and then tell that story. But recently we've been seeing so much more of them. I think The Crane Husband is an example, Untethered Sky, or you're seeing books that are really on the short side, something like Nettle in Bone by T. Kingfisher. I had some ideas of what makes a good fantasy really challenged when I started picking up more novellas. It actually makes me look at a lot of other fantasy books and question, did you need that much time to develop that world? Because this author told a fantastic story in a very short amount of time. And that brings up the question of, are authors sometimes, especially the popular ones, are they being edited as strongly as they should be? Do we always need that massive page count for it to be a good story? And I remember really distinctly when Rhythm of War was coming out, this was of course a couple of years ago, not this year, but when Rhythm of War was coming out, I actually got an arc of it, and my arc is much slimmer than the final copy because of the fact that it's printed on thinner pages. And so when it was on my shelf, it was looking like it was much smaller than the previous book, Oathbringer. And we're talking about books that every single book in the series is over 1,000 pages. But I remember really distinctly there was a comment that said, really disappointed to see that Rhythm of War is shorter than Oathbringer. That doesn't give me high hopes. And I was like, it's actually longer than Oathbringer. It's just an arc. But I was like, really? What if it was better than Oathbringer? It just happened to be shorter. So I kind of don't know. It's sort of like a matter of, was it the chicken or the egg? Is it that readers expect fantasy books to be long and that's why authors feel the need to put that world building in? Or is it that a good world actually does take time to develop and thus that is why there's this massive page count? Or does it depend on the story? You know, I just can't quite tell why there seems to be this resistance on the reader's end to give shorter fantasy books a try. And that's why I was saying I'm trying to challenge myself in that and pick up more of those shorter stories. Part of what really encouraged me to do this was I always have said that for the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, I think his short stories are much better than the main portion of the series itself. And I thought, okay, if I feel that way about his collections of short stories, then maybe I need to be open more to picking up novellas, because in the past I didn't really want to pick them up at all. It could also be that a lot of authors have gotten much stronger at that form of storytelling, at that shorter amount of time. It could be that publishing is just putting it out more. I'm not really sure what it is, but I actually am very excited about this trend, and I think it's going to be here for a while. The reason I think this is that in 2020, because of the state of the world at that time, so many people were getting into reading. And I think there was a shift in the amount of series that we got in fantasy versus standalones. For a long time, a complaint of fantasy readers was there aren't enough standalones. I wish there was more fantasy standalones. I wish there could be a one and done story. I'm a little exhausted. You get it. So I think standalones actually became a lot more common because there was this opportunity for the publishing industry to pull new readers in And with fantasy, it's hard to pull new readers in when the series are all that are lining the bookstore shelves, or I guess are the things to purchase online since people weren't often going into stores. But it's like we want to be able to deliver you a story and be like, here, try this. And then if you like it, you're like, I liked that. And you don't have to be daunted by the fact that there's so many books that you'd have to consume to get a complete story. And since then, I think standalones have stuck and they've been here and we've been getting more and more and more. I think this is tied to mythology retellings, which is another thing on my list of trends. I think that those go pretty hand in hand, but it has made fantasy more accessible, especially adult fantasy. It's made that a lot easier to get into now. So I think that the novella short stories are going to stay. I also say this because they charge, as far as the physical copies, from what I understand, to print a smaller thing. It's almost like the more you have to deliver, like big companies, they get a break on delivery versus if you're just shipping one item. If I understand correctly, novellas, when they're printed, there's a reason they cost more than it seems like they should, and it has something to do with the printing and that concept of you're printing less, when if it was in bulk, it would be different. Regardless, they're still charging a fair amount, and you can pump out more of those if the authors are writing a lot. So I use the example of Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher being a shorter work. She writes so many books. There's already 2 releases last year, and then I was really excited to see there was another release coming out this year, A House with Good Bones, which I don't think I've talked about yet on my channel. I really liked that book. But anyway, and then she's got another book coming out, and I'm like, how? How does she write so many books? And I think it helps that her books are on the shorter side. So I can see this one staying. The only way I could see it going is if there is at some point a backlash from readers where they're just sick of the shorter works, if they're not selling as well, or if there are the long series that are starting to sell really well. If there's an author that everybody is running out to buy their next book. One more thing to add, I promise I have more trends to discuss than this first one, but because we're talking about fantasy specifically a lot with this particular trend, there's also the fact that with series, you run the risk of authors like George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss that don't finish them. And on top of that, if you do hold them to their deadlines, sometimes I think you can end up putting out a series that the ending is not satisfying to the readers, and then it might make them hesitant to pick something else up by that author. So I just think that it's kind of safer, even if you have a short story or novella that you're not the biggest fan of, you're like, well, I mean, it was a novella, so I probably just didn't have enough time with it to like it. And then it's much easier to try something else because it's so short and so much less of a commitment. Because I mentioned it a second ago, I'll go ahead and get into the Greek mythology retellings. I don't necessarily think that these are going to leave anytime soon, because I think Greek mythology retellings are just always going to be a thing. However, I don't think they're going to be as dominant in the retelling space, because I think readers are already starting to get tired of them. So what I could see happening is we stick to retellings being common, but we start to focus on different mythology. And I think that that's actually going to really shift even just fiction and fantasy in general, because it's going to open people's eyes to a lot of mythology they're less familiar with. And I can't tell if this is a pro or a con, but Greek mythology retellings seem to be difficult to please readers with, because a lot of people are very picky about the mythology retellings, especially because a lot of people know a lot about them and they've seen them done so many times before, and they inevitably either compare it to the original story or they compare it to another version of that retelling and they're like, but it's not as good as this one. And if you have mythology retellings that you just don't see as often, you might have a chance of readers, because it's new and it feels original to them, that they would end up giving it a more favorable rating. And they aren't going to be comparing it to all the other versions of that story that came before. Or because there's that lack of familiarity, I could see readers also going into it and thinking, this is weird, the story's strange, because sometimes readers do that. I'm not sure, but I think I would personally like it if we kind of chilled with the Greek mythology retellings and tried some some new ones. Next, we're just gonna go through one that's very, very quick, and that would be a certain name trend. And a lot of you know what it is. It is the blank of blank and blank naming trend. This has been a trend for a very long time, and I think it's on its way out. I think it's on its way out. I think publishing knows that we're tired of that naming trend. One of you, the last time I did a video talking about trends, said that someone told you that the phrase "a bowl of mac and cheese" fits that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it does. It does fit that. And now I have a random question that has nothing to do with books. For those of you that eat mac and cheese, do you eat it on a plate or do you eat it in a bowl? Because it's a bowl of mac and cheese, but I guess it could be a plate of mac and cheese for this naming convention. That works too. But my thing is, if it's the main course, it's in a bowl. And if it's a side, it's on the plate with the food. It's not like a side bowl of mac and cheese. But anyway, a bowl of mac and cheese, getting back to this naming convention. That's hilarious. To the person that mentioned that, thank you. That was very entertaining to me. But anyway, I think this is on its way out. The only one that I can think of right off the top of my head that's coming out, that's newer, is A House of Root and Ruin, which is a sequel to A House of Salt and Sorrow, which was previously considered a standalone. A House of Salt and Sorrow came out years ago. So it makes sense that this naming convention would stick because you're just keeping with that for that series. So it's just cohesive. That makes sense. But I think most of the books I've seen come out this year, I'm like looking at some books that are surrounding me. I don't think a lot of them are following that trend, which is nice. However, there is a new naming trend that I have noticed recently, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this, which is the really long titles. This isn't necessarily brand new. I know in the past there have been books with really long titles, and usually those books are satirical or there's aspects to them that are slightly absurd, and so that really long title was fitting. But not everything that's coming out is within that. So I really adored this book. I thought it was precious, and that would be The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. That's a really long title. It's a mouthful. I think I almost always abbreviate it to Irregular Witches in my notes. One of Sanderson's secret projects, A Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England, is so long. And that's another one that I'm constantly just abbreviating. But that, I think, is sort of trying to pay its respects to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a lot of those other books that seem to have inspired that one, and so the title is inspired as well. But not all of them. I think some of them are just long, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know. It's a really long title. But at the end of the day, I guess it doesn't matter that much. Have you noticed that? Does it feel like titles are getting longer? Anyway, switching gears, because I mentioned A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, let's shift now into two subgenres of fantasy that are becoming really common, and that would be fantasy romance and cozy fantasy. I want to be clear, fantasy romance is not new. I just think it is becoming a lot more mainstream. What I was talking about before, where 2020 seemed to pull a lot of people in, I think 2020 pulled a lot of people in, and the series they discovered when they tried fantasy was A Court of Thorns and Roses. Feels full circle, like we're bringing all the trends together. And they tried that series and they thought, oh my gosh, I loved this. And then they were wanting to pick up more like that, and then that led them inevitably to other fantasy romance books, to a point where bookstores, it seems like, are actually starting to have fantasy romance sections, which is pretty cool, actually, because it makes it a lot easier for readers to find what they're looking for, and because some people that aren't looking for that heavy an amount of romance in their fantasy books, they might not know if there isn't a set fantasy romance section. They might go to fantasy, see a book they think sounds interesting, pick it up, and be like, oh, this is fantasy romance, which is fine. It's just not what I'm looking for. So I think this makes it easier for readers to figure out what is going to appeal to them. I guess I'm more so wondering if we're going to actually see this stay as its own genre. I am a little nervous because when new adult, that age range was first becoming actually its own age range and formally recognized, that tanked pretty quick. And so I am a little nervous that fantasy romance, that it's going to experience that same thing where you have this jump of people that are invested and really excited about it, and then it's going to fade, and then you're not going to see a lot of new books, or you're not going to really see, I don't know, I can't tell if it being seen as its own genre is going to stay, or if it's eventually going to disperse and you're going to see those books end up either in young adult or just adult fantasy. I'm not sure, but I think it's here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's here to stay, and I think it's only building, and I think we're going to start to see more and more bookstores have specific sections for it. And then with cozy fantasy, I don't necessarily think cozy fantasy is ever going to have its own shelves or anything because it's a little too niche of a subgenre. But cozy fantasy, in a lot of ways, I think, one, was a result of all of the hardships that people were enduring during 2020, and just in life in general. It doesn't just have to be that year. And then finding books that were just so whimsical and cheerful and joyful and being like, oh, this is what I need to get through the day. This is what I need to get through life. And so you're seeing this uptick of people enjoying cozy fantasy, and just because it's sometimes nice to read things that are sweet. I also would say I think cozy fantasy is a pushback against grimdark. Obviously, there were years where fantasy was defined, it felt like, by Game of Thrones. And thus, so many things coming out after were making an effort to have all these twists and turns and surprising deaths and gruesome moments and really horrible villains. And people were trying to do that, and it became really common. But I think that it's so grotesque, some of the material, that if it's not done in a way that's compelling, if you don't have those characters that people feel really attached to, then it just reads as gross. It just reads as it just is like horrific for the sake of being horrific. And I think it was a pushback. Cozy fantasy was kind of like, well, if you're tired of all of that or you need a break from all of that, how about you read this fun little story about this character who XYZ, fill in the blank. There's something nice. Let's try that. And I think a lot of people were like, oh, they felt emotions they weren't expecting to feel going into a fantasy story. And just going into a story, because so many books are a reflection of our hardships, that to actually just see something that's hopeful and nice, it's refreshing. It's refreshing. So I don't think cozy fantasy is going anywhere. I just think that the hype around it is going to die down. Because I also think, similar to what I was saying about grimdark, cozy fantasy is going to get to a point where everybody is trying to write their cozy fantasy, and some people are just... I think I should backtrack. I think publishing is just going to throw whatever cozy fantasy story comes their way while the trend is high. They're just going to throw everything out, and I think at some point people are going to... I don't know that they're necessarily going to get sick of cozy fantasy. They're going to start to, I think, get sick of reading the same thing over and over, or feeling like the cozy fantasy doesn't have substance, doesn't have depth to it. I could be wrong, but hopefully publishing doesn't try to milk it until we're sick of it, because I like cozy fantasy and I want it to stay. That's it though for my thoughts on some of these common trends that I've been seeing over the last 6 months or even into the last couple of years. And I would love to know, as I said at the beginning, whether you want these to stay, you want them to leave, and also what other trends that you have noticed. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.